On social media, some Americans worry this decision puts presidents above the law, while others argue it only relieves Donald Trump of any wrongdoing. But the most vocal reactions came from leaders across the U.S. WIFR reporter Sydney Stoffregan talks to local officials from both sides of the podium.
The opinion of the Supreme Court is that the nature of presidential power requires a former president have some immunity from criminal prosecution for official acts in office. But the minority response, Justice Sonia Sotomayor, calls the decision misguided wisdom about the need for bold and unhesitating action.
It's really disappointing.
I think it's a huge win.
Former President Donald Trump calls the Supreme Court decision a big win for our Constitution and democracy. But one of Trump's harshest critics, former U.S. Representative Adam Kinzinger, blasted the ruling and says it shouldn't have been made at the last minute.
Telling the Attorney General, just say the election was corrupt and leave the rest to me and the Republican congressmen. If the Attorney General doesn't do it, the president can fire him to bring somebody else in and not be held accountable. Is that the kind of country we want to live in?
The Biden-Harris campaign's response was swift and harsh, claiming Donald Trump believes he is above the law and is willing to do anything to hold on to power. But State Representative John Cabello disagrees, saying there needs to be safeguards to protect a president when they make a hard decision.
We don't want a president to worry about criminal prosecutions if he needs to, unfortunately, make an executive decision as our chief commanding officer.
17th District Representative Eric Sorensen says this is more about what is right, no matter who is involved.
Look, I mean, the decision from the Supreme Court today is very serious. But the point needs to be made that no one should be above the law. Everyone needs to follow the law.
The Biden-Harris campaign also says that today's ruling does not change the facts and that Joe Biden will make sure Americans reject Donald Trump's request for power for good in November.
Thank you, Sydney. And Donald Trump took to his social media platform, Truth Social, to say without presidential immunity, a president of the United States could not function. He adds it should be a strong immunity where opponents cannot extort a future president for political gain.